All right, now the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is facing some fresh challenges. Washington is pushing him to hold elections under martial law, and Zelensky now must strike a balance between maintaining democratic governance and ensuring national survival. Now, just a day after expressing his readiness to hold elections, Volodymyr Zelensky knocked the door of the country's parliament. He has asked the parliamentarians to lay out their vision for elections. Now, the parliament where his party holds absolute majority.
Як це провести? Як це зробити під ударами, під ракетами, щодо наших військових, питання, як вони будуть голосувати, ви це знаєте, і не хочу повторювати. І друге питання – законодавча основа для легітимності проведення виборів. І так як це питання сьогодні піднімає президент Сполучених Штатів Америки, наші партнери, я відповім дуже коротко. Дивіться, я готовий до виборів. Мало того, я прошу зараз, заявляю це відкрито, Сполучені Штати Америки допомогти мені. Можна разом з європейськими колегами забезпечити безпеку для проведення виборів.
Now, the last presidential election that took place in Ukraine was held in 2019, and under the normal circumstances, the next elections should have been held back in 2024. But martial law had put the elections on hold. So as things stand at the moment, the next elections are to be held within 6 months after martial law is lifted. Now, President Zelensky has said that he's ready for the polls within the next 90 days, but can he really do that? Let's take a look at some of the challenges that stand in the way of elections in Ukraine at the moment. Now, Ukraine is currently under martial law. The country's constitution suspends all elections during such periods. Now, Zelensky will have to find a way around this provision and make sure that the electoral process still remains free and fair. Now, 1/5 of Ukraine is currently under Russia's control. So what happens to the areas that are under the control of Russia? Now, there are 6 regions of concern. The Russian forces are deep inside Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, while the front line is still open in Sumy and in the Kharkiv region. Now, funding war and elections is going to be the next big challenge. And according to the Central Election Committee's 2023 calculations, the collective cost of Ukraine's presidential and parliamentary elections could go up to $350 million. So how will Ukraine manage to fund it at a time when the country is spending and double than its budget for the war? The next big challenge is voting rights of the Ukrainians who fled the war. Almost about 6 to 7 million Ukrainians have fled the country since the war began. They're living abroad in temporary protections. Ensuring their participation in the elections will be another logistical challenge. The similar challenge will also be faced by soldiers who are engaged in fighting. Allowing them to exercise their voting rights might weaken their position on the front line. The final challenge would be to get the voters to the polling booths. Russia and Ukraine carry out drone attacks deep inside each other's territory. The Russian drones have hit cities as far west as Lviv in Ukraine. So how will Ukraine now convince the voters to step out and cast their ballot while the threat of drones and missiles from Russia looms over the Ukrainian skies? And to tell us how feasible this is, we are now joined on the broadcast by Dr. Glenn Deason. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. He's joining us all the way from Oslo. Dr. Deason, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky has expressed his willingness to hold elections within the next 90 days. But the question is of feasibility at a time when the martial law is in place. Do you think this can be done?
Well, it's going to be difficult, but still it's seen as necessary. Both the United States and Russia thinks that Zelensky continuing to hold on to power is a key obstruction towards finding a peaceful settlement. But the problem of an election is, well, it's real. How do you have elections during under a war zone? How do you, as you just mentioned, how will the soldiers get to vote? And also for the millions who fled the country, do they also get to vote? We have millions of Ukrainians in Russia as well. Shouldn't they be allowed to vote? So there's a lot of questions which have to be addressed. And but it also seems as if Zelensky would like to use this opportunity or as at least condition election on bringing NATO into Ukraine. That is, he suggested that in order to have elections for 60 to 90 days, that is 2 to 3 months, NATO will have to essentially make sure that there's no attacks. So I'm not sure what this means. Is this intercepting drones? Is it's really unclear, and this is a non-starter for Russia because this kind of falls within the same ploy as we've previously seen, that is imposing essentially a temporary ceasefire. But as soon as there's a temporary ceasefire, there's no incentive anymore for Ukraine or the Europeans or the Americans, for that sake, to make any concessions in terms of restoring Ukraine's neutrality or accepting these territorial concessions.
You know, you've touched upon several very interesting scenarios that could play out. Now, the Russian leadership, that's Vladimir Putin, does not recognize Volodymyr Zelensky to be a legitimate ruler in Kiev, for quite some time now. He's made that pretty clear. Do you think elections could be one of the ways in which probably the Russian leadership and also the American leadership would want to try and get rid of Volodymyr Zelensky so that some kind of a peace deal could be agreed on the terms that Moscow and Washington want, which Kiev under Volodymyr Zelensky would not agree to?
Well, it's possible, but the legitimacy is a key issue as well, which the Russians have raised, because the concern, according to Moscow, is that if whatever Zelensky will sign, that later on a future Ukrainian government can say that this was illegitimate, given that Zelensky was illegitimate since he overstayed his presidential term. Now, so there's a lot of questions tied into how they can find someone to essentially sign under on whatever peace agreements there will be. And the United States also, of course, I suspect that they have been behind leaking some of the bigger stories about this. The scandals about corruption in Ukraine, because I think they also see that there's a need to push Zelensky aside to get the peace agreement. And so, no, I do think that it's going to be, well, this is primarily a proxy war between the US and Russia. So I think the Americans and the Russians will have to first come to a settlement, and then they will likely push it on Ukraine.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Glenn Deason, for joining us from Oslo and getting us that perspective there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.